Okay, hello folks. We're gonna share screen here and we're gonna hit share and not quite, almost. We'll play. Okay, I think yeah, plug in. Everybody can see that now, right? Off we go. Just a follow-up from last week, talking about the moment of truth here in the studio. A map of how countries are lining up for Hamas around the world. Jubilation in the studio. Technology, we're getting it to work finally. So the people that are backing are leaning towards Hamas, and we welcome Homer. Hello, Homer, and maybe Jenny. So the people in the brighter colors are the people that are kind of siding with Iran and that part of the religious spectrum. Colombia, very, very leftist government, also shading towards Hamas, as is South Africa, because of the lengthy history of the ANC with the cause of the Palestinians. Notable again, India remains solidly on the side of Israel, and this could possibly be due to the problems that they're having in their country with Islam. Okay, so I just thought every once in a while we do a little catch up. I mentioned I'm hearing somebody talking. I mentioned the movie about the behind the scenes at Oslo, and this is one. I'm not sure it's the one I saw, but it's highly ranked, available on Prime. Jim Teisel sent us a relevant slide. Why is this slide relevant? Showing the 10-year journey of Odysseus, Ulysses, home after the Trojan War, because he stops at Majorca. Yes, he stops at Majorca, and it's on the island of Majorca, where Ulysses, his men are converted into pigs by Circe, right on Majorca. This is witnessed by another sailor, and he runs back to the ship and gets Ulysses, and they come back and force Circe to turn the men back from pigs. This is from a series that I read to my grandkids on the Greek myths. I recommend the Usborne series because they have just the right mix of pictures to text for young kids. And this is the Western Mediterranean, just showing once again more clearly. This is from one of our books on Junipero Serra, Mallorca, and how closely it's tied into Catalonia and Barcelona. Just to throw in another one of the Greek myths that's related to the Black Sea that we've been talking about a lot, and Crimea. And where do you think the Golden Fleece was hung from? In Colchis. In Colchis, which is, I guess, in northern Georgia, Abkhazia, somewhere there. That's where Medea was a princess in a kingdom. and it shows familiar geography that we've been talking about. And it also explains, and we saw Timothy Snyder point this out early in his lectures, that the north coast of the Black Sea was settled by the Greeks. So it's no surprise. And that's why you have all these policies, Sevastopol, Simferopol, Mariupol. And we've been following the names of these cities in southern Ukraine, where the Greeks hung out. And there was some ancient influence, but it was also supercharged by Catherine the Great. She was a classical scholar fan, and had classical scholars, and her dream was to change the Crimea into another, go back to its Greek roots. Okay. Update over the controversy with Serra. And the reason I'm spending so much time on Serra is there's so much a controversy. So I keep running into new stuff, and I thought you'd be interested before we resume the chronological story. Our school kids probably read some of these books in school, graphic comics of his life. I even have poached a couple of visuals from there. And in the front of one of them, it's a little forward with Pope Francis, who sanctified Junipero Serra. We went through all that when he visited Washington in 2015. On the other side, it's hard to avoid the critical thinking about what Serra actually was doing, intentionally or non-intentionally, and there's a big difference. I ran across this guy that David Pepper and Jim Teisel may remember. David Klinik, who's with us occasionally, and our paleontologist, talks about this guy, Andrew Galvan. He is like the representative of the Miwoks and Ohlonies in the area, and he's the guy that if a developer starts digging and digs up Indian bones, everything stops, and you call Andrew Galvan. Right now, for Homer and Jenny, he's the curator at the Museum of Mission Dolores. And as I said, he's a descendant of the Ohlonian Miwoks, so he's got the family tree to be able to negotiate this stuff and the standing. He looks at all the criticism of Serra now and says this negativity is an opportunity for transformation. And he was one of the leading defenders of Serra in the canonization process. He points out, and I think this is an excellent point, there's a difference between admiring the man and condemning the system. And it certainly makes history more interesting. I've been engaged in conversations about Serra, which ended very abruptly when the other person just didn't want to hear the history. And so I like his approach. But he does also point out that the myth of the mission that's taught in our school is certainly a romanticized view of mission life, and he's involved in teaching school kids. So for Aiko and Shigeko, they grew up in the shadow of Mission San Jose, and his great grandfather was a chieftain there, Chief Torino. He also has another great grandfather, and I think you probably have 32 great grandfathers. I'd have to do the math and count with my binary system, but somebody can correct me. But he had another one that was who was baptized in the Mission Dolores very early in the 1794s. Remember, we're only going to be at 1768 in a few minutes, I hope. Anyway, he points out to school kids, this mission was built by Indians for Indians. And I like that too. And it's a good way to keep history alive and not dismiss it. And I think he views the work of people like David Klinick doing archaeological work as retrieving hello, Ray. Retrieving what some people have lost of their history. He is also doing a makeover of the guides and the guidelines that are taught, updating for new information for the docents that go around in the 21 missions. What's his credential? He has a BA in history from state of California, Hayward. All right. Moving on, here are some other experts in the Miwoks. Carol's not here today, nor is Barbara, unfortunately. And by the way, they were both very grateful for some of us that were able to collect clothes for Ukraine. Rudy, who's in the studio, was part of that too, part of our local pub group. But this is, of course, Janet Thomas and Connie Loosely, who volunteer hours and hours, as do Carol and Barbara, to teach school kids about the Miwok life. And Aiko and I were also invited to this little luncheon of the Miwok tribelet. And we enjoyed it very much, the conversation. So this was a more analytical article about Andrew Galvan, and I'd be curious what David Klinick says. I'll make sure that he pulls up the video of today. And this is a whole article, The Bones of Discontent, about keeping history alive. He gives a course, and if any of you want to do it, it's online, available, divided into these 4 parts, and we're almost to the 3rd part in our slow process of with all the tangents we take. But we're making progress, and here's the exact link. I could send it to you. All right, so back to Serra on Mallorca, a good student, an excellent student, and at one point he starts thinking about going beyond Mallorca, doing what his mentor never did. But he's got a sidekick. this Palu, you're going to hear a lot about Palu as we finish. I think we've mentioned him before. He's 10 years younger than Serra, also from Petra. It's in the middle of Mallorca, and is in fact bonds more tightly with Serra when he takes Serra's course in philosophy. And like Serra, who after he finished studying remained on the staff, so does Palu. And they suddenly find that they're both intrigued with leaving Mallorca and going to the New World. Maybe inspired by somebody like Teresa Agreda. You remember she's the nun from the previous century who claimed that she could bilocate and do mission work without ever leaving her nunnery. We'll hear more about him when we do the De Anza expedition, because he does that on his own. And then he moves to Mission Dolores. And he stayed in the Mission Dolores until Serra sent for him to deliver him the last rites at Carmel. There's another person you're going to hear a lot, and we've already heard about him when we talked about the Carquinez Straits and the expedition that circumnavigated the bay, and Juan Crespi was on that. He was also a contemporary of Palu, had gone to the same university in Palma and heard Serra speak. He joined, so you really had a triumvirate of three Mallorcans that came at the same time. There were plenty of Mallorcans who had already gone to the New World, but Crespi, Palu, and Serra all came at the same time. Serra liked teaching. He thought that he was building up a flock of students that would say a blessing for him when he died. That was always on his mind, making a reputation for himself. Very ambitious. As you can see in Palu's biography of Junipero Serra, written shortly after his death. So Serra was a charismatic guy. He commanded a following in Palma when he became a professor there. And you'll see that he's going to go to the New World and do the same thing, collect a group of disciples. So he's more than your average priest. Now, I'm going to take a little tangent here and do something that we've done a few times, and I would encourage any of you that want to do it to bring a landmark to class, maybe take photos of it, and do a show and tell. And it's been a while since we've done show and tell. Carol did a memorable one on Lafayette, the city, the old town. If we're all nice to Carol, maybe she would reprise that. When Aiko and I went to Havana, we saw a statue of Serra in the central square. When we were really surprised to see that. And we were told at the time, well, yeah, because Serra went to Havana. But did he? So, you lift up a rock and look under it, and sometimes you're surprised. It would depend if Serra went to Havana in between Puerto Rico and Veracruz. And this is the statue that Aiko and I saw when we were strolling around Havana. Serra with a young boy, and they're both looking out to sea. The Franciscan church in Havana is obviously not used anymore. There was an interruption there for 40 years. It's used now as a concert hall. This is a copy. This statue, it turns out, is a copy of the one in Palma. And I just learned that from the report of a tourist, an American tourist, who went further in pursuing a prominent memorial than I did. So hooray for him. The original in Palma had been commissioned for Serra's 250th birthday in 1963. So that's not an old statue that we saw when we were doing a deep dive on Mallorca. This statue had only been up a few years when Aiko and I saw it. I think we were there about 10 years ago, so it had only been up for 10 years. But that's not what our guide told us. Our guide said it was there because Serra had been in Havana. This is the original in Mallorca, in Palma, of which that's a copy. This is a statue of Serra in his hometown of Petra. This tourist from San Juan Capistrano, and that's going to be important in just a second to know where he was coming from. He looked at this statue, and he thought about the statue of Serra that's at the Mission in San Juan Capistrano. So he had an incentive to do a deeper dive because of the statue in his hometown. And he found out that an international hotel chain based in Mallorca had paid for that statue in Havana that Aiko and I saw. And they did it and put it up in 2004 when they opened the first 5-star hotel in Havana. Oh, wait a minute. There's a conflict of interest here in history. So they donated an exact replica, because what happens when in modern days, when statues are made, you can preserve the mold and make copies. And that's what they did for Havana. Now, in Havana, appropriately, there's 4 main squares, 4 main plazas. And one of them is called the Plaza of San Francisco. And it was an important plaza, as you'll see in just a second. This tourist from San Juan Capistrano says they took liberties. She found the hotel docent very helpful, but the docent could only find one article that even hinted that Serra had been in Havana. And it was, he left Spain, arrived in Puerto Rico, and then went on to Veracruz after various stops without naming Havana, which is odd, that they didn't mention it. So conflict of interest for our most international Franciscan, and for the boat that Serra was on to have actually stopped in Havana in between Puerto Rico and Veracruz would have extended the voyage by over 500 miles. And when you look at the dates, the amateur historian from San Juan Capistrano says that wouldn't have been possible when you figure out the speeds of ships then. And so here's Puerto Rico. Sorry, this is a little blurry. Here's Veracruz. The most direct way would have been to skirt by Jamaica, come up and around the Yucatan and go into Veracruz. To go to Havana, which is on the north side of Cuba, the San Juan Capistrano tourist says would have extended it by an awful lot. Here's the statue in San Juan Capistrano that incentivized this tourist to really do a deep dive on the statue. Notice, can you notice one difference between this statue and the statues in Havana and Palma? The boy was looking out to sea with Serra. Now the boy is facing Serra. And I don't know what the meaning of that was. See the difference? And it was odd that Palu didn't mention it in his biography of Serra. He was with Serra, and he didn't say they stopped in Havana. And that, if they had, he would have definitely mentioned it, because the plaza there was a focal point of Christianity and Christian culture since nearly the beginning. A short distance away is the monastery of, or the church of St. Francis, with a high bell tower on which a statue of Serra stood for a long time, but it was destroyed by a hurricane and has not been replaced. So to not mention stopping here is a little bit like Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark. You had to explain a negative. And he thinks that nails the argument that Serra never did stop, because there was no mention of it. Final note on that statue in San Juan Capistrano: the mission and the Catholic Church voluntarily took down the statue because they were afraid of it being defaced the way the one in Golden Gate Park was. And so they did that soon after the demonstrations, not only in San Francisco, but also in Los Angeles. And those that bought it down said Serra was being remembered for hate, bigotry, and colonization. But the San Juan Capistrano parishioners are, quote, now devastated that a piece of history is gone. So that's the other way of looking at it. Just looking at scholars, the book that I've been recommending by Stephen Hackle, he is the severest critic that I've been able to find in scholarship. There are other biographies of Serra which are more in the nature of praising him. But Hackle does both. I think it's a balanced critique, a little bit like Galvan and the things that he says. And this is Hackle himself. He says, on one hand, Serra brought civilization. Remember, these people are hunter-gatherers, and is hunter-gathering a option now? Well, I think maybe some people think it is. We certainly did back in the 60s when we were going back to communes in the farm. He bought civilization, that option, but there was a brutality. But as we go through the story, step by step in the chronology, you'll find that Serra was as much a restraining force as he was an initiator of brutality. You'll find many examples of him opposing these Spanish Presidio soldiers and the way they were treating Native Americans. He had the will, and he certainly was a skillful administrator and had the driving force. But he did use what Hackle calls spanking. So it wasn't a whip, but there was some physical aggressiveness. So I'm just trying to get in front of some of the stories, so we're looking at it from the different points of view of the critics. I hope it's helpful. I know it's slowing us down a bit. I don't know how many of you have noticed this on Highway 280 when you're driving along, but just outside of Hillsborough, and it was defaced. All right. So whether they went to Havana or not, and probably not, they finally arrive in Veracruz, and Serra refuses to ride on horseback to Mexico City, because he is striving for the purity that St. Francis found. And the only problem with him walking all this way is he got bit a lot. And one bite was so severe and so venomous, and there's an argument about what it was, that he developed a leg ulcer lifelong. The physicians among us have probably struggled with ulcers in the lower leg, where the circulation is the poorest, and where stasis, the blood doesn't get back as easily from the ankle, for instance, to the heart as it does from the arm to the heart. So those are chronic problems, often requiring chronic topical treatments. And we're going to see later on, when a wound festers, Serra resorts to the muleteer. that takes care of the mules and their health. He sees him applying a thick ointment to the mule's injury, and he tries it, and it does help him, which fits. One of the things that we've used in dermatology is a product called bag balm, which dairy farmers use on the udders of cows, a soothing ointment. And then we know from biblical terms that you anoint your foot with oil. So Palu, independent achievement. He walks with them up to Mexico City. I've already told you about Mission Dolores and applying the last rites. Their destination was a specific college that was designed to train priests for working among the indigenous populations. And for that reason, it's called an evangelical seminary, or Colegio Apostolico. There were many Mallorcans there, and Franciscans, and among them in 1749, these three arrive. After he completes his course there, his first mission, and we mentioned this last time, is Sierra Gorda. I hope I got that right this time. And John Tyson, Jim told us last time that you've taken vacations there. Welcome your input. But in Sierra Gorda missions, he introduced teaching crafts to women to take them beyond the hunter-gatherer economy, and perhaps introduce something women could make that they could supplement in the marketplace. Again, I'll mention the movie The Mission, that Mike Stein and I have seen, because this really brings home what an enlightened priest can do. Now, in the case of the mission, they're Jesuits, being in an earlier time period than where we are, and he builds the churches out of stone. Before, most of the missions had been built out of wood, and obviously were more temporary. But he directed the building of missions in stone, and they still stand, and they've become World Heritage Sites, as I mentioned in a previous talk. In the Baroque style, which certainly demands more artisan talent and time. I showed you the five mission churches that he built, and this is perhaps the most beautiful. So after 9 years in Sierra Gorda, he's called back to the College of San Fernando. And by the way, all the missionaries from Mallorca that go there are called Fernandinos. Fernandinos. We'll perhaps encounter that term later on. But it's a stage, yet another stage after Palma, for Serra to exert his charisma. So he's more than just a single priests slaving away. He's got an entourage. Um, so he was supposed to go to Texas, but for various reasons, that assignment was canceled, and he remained in Mexico City for another 9 years. So that's 19 year delay of him getting to the frontier, which is where he wanted to be, as on the most distant frontier possible. And now, at the age of 53 or 54, he's going to get the call. So what does he do in Mexico City during that 9 years? He works for the Inquisition, and this is maybe what is causing some of the most vociferous criticism of it. But on the other hand, he's investigating black magic that may be afoot in Mexico City. I thought it was interesting. There was one Japanese Mexican artist who depicted that time period. Enter a special emissary from Carlos III. Carlos III is looking at Spain's standard in the world, and he's nervous. Why is he nervous? Well, we'll see. He calls Galvez from the Archive of the Indies in Seville, where a lot of the records are kept. So this guy, Jose Galvez, is quite learned and capable. And now he's a special assistant, an inspector, if you will, that it has almost equal power to the viceroy. And he is sent to Mexico to help Spain regain some international standing and clout. Galvez himself is a kind of a rags to riches story. He was from a noble family, but they'd become impoverished, so he supported himself as a shepherd to start off with. But he became a master in law. And Serra, as we'll see later in the career, used the legal system that had been developed in Spain in the context of the New World and Native Americans to defend Native Americans. And so that's a plus on Serra's side. So the visitor inspector general comes right after the 7 Years' War. And what happened in the 7 Years' War that would worry Carlos III so much? I'll come back to this. The 7 Years' War had obviously eliminated the French blue there, and Britain had prevailed, and they're going to get this land. But something strange happens to Spanish holdings. They're going to lose Florida because of the 7 Years' War. But look what happens in the settlement. They're going to gain and more than compensate for Florida with all this land, which later is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. So here are the new frontiers after the 7 Years' War. And Spain now has a more solid hold in North America. I have to credit Jim Teisel for finding this map. Spanish Louisiana, and we learn of Spanish settlements along the Mississippi, including New Orleans. So when you go to New Orleans, you go to the French Quarter and you see French architecture, but then you see the Spanish influence in architecture because for about 30 years, Spain influenced New Orleans more than anybody. They've got a lot to protect all of a sudden after the 7 Years' War. Protect from who? I mentioned this earlier, the Russians. Catherine the Great has followed the example of Peter the Great and expanding the Russian sphere of influence. People did not know much about Northern California, and I've shown a map before where it's terra incognito. Nobody knows what's going on up here. But there is one map by a Pedro Calderon that shows Russian influence coming down, almost reaching Monterey itself. Well, we know they never got to Monterey, but they got to Fort Ross. But at the time, there was a lot of fear, not just of England, who had defeated them in the 7 Years' War, but also of Russia. That's one incentive for the Inspector General to say, okay, we got to go and tame Alta California, not just Baja California. And the Russians had recruited the Aleutians and were supplementing their own skill at fur trapping. How are we doing on time?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Just to go back to the time of Father Kino, he had set up, you remember, all these missions in Baja. He had been much more successful on the mainland in Sonora, but he'd set up Loreto, and this is where Junipero Serra is going to start. Once he gets the call, that'll be his starting point for the sacred expedition that we're really going to get into. And it's quite an adventure. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that because that's a little bit like our Revolutionary War, a foundational story. You'll remember he encountered Father Kino had the indigenous tribes. The Parakou are hostile, as are the Kumeyaay, who Sarah is going to encounter in San Diego quite soon. Palu is when they're given the assignment to take over the missions, Palu gets the mission San Francisco de Vega Bianduna. Sorry, but that's what it looked like, and it was quite just north of Loreto. Here, just as a side, is the mission at San Lucas de Capa, where a lot of us have vacationed. The Parakou in the very south, who were hostile, they had their numbers had fallen after they led a revolt. And they'd lost numbers from smallpox and syphilis and typhus, but also their birth rate had been reduced, and that could be for a lot of reasons. Obviously, it could be psychological too. And they were what's called culturally extinct, except for the ones furthest away from the Spanish. And the fall of numbers was catastrophic. From 60,000 eventually to 6,000. So that's in keeping with a lot of the numbers that we see, a 90% reduction. So the Jesuits had established 17 missions over their 60 years. And they had 56 missionaries, 16 had died. 15 priests had, by the end, had survived, only to be thrown out by Carlos III and his inspector general. And so I think we'll end with what the Fernandinos saw when they came. They saw that the Jesuits were really dejected. And they acknowledged that there had been a huge fall in population under their watch. But one of them says, the world misses little. And describes them quite insultingly. And they're pretty much giving up. To just to make that a little more understandable, Baja was probably the most unlikely place to succeed with proselytizing. The economy, there wasn't much value to be gained from abandoning the hunter-gatherer lifestyle because the land was not hospitable for the agricultural revolution. Okay, so this is where we'll start next time with the Visitor General Galvez. Throwing out the Jesuits and bringing in Serra, and they're going to plan and the sacred expedition. And Portola is a name that's familiar to us all. I think Homer and Jenny live near a street called Portola. And we'll see he's going to appear on the scene on the secular side to partner with Junipero Serra in the sacred expedition. Okay, so any questions, discussion? Rudy.
I was just wondering, why would they include a statue of a little boy with the Junipero Serra statue?
Well, I don't know, and of course now it invites all kind of prurient criticism. I thought it was interesting which way the boy was facing, but I don't know. But I think Homer's going to tell us. Homer.
Oh no, I'm not going to tell you anything on that. Another point entirely.
Okay.
Okay. Well, yes, we do live near Portola Drive or Portola Road. What is it? Portola Boulevard in San Francisco. My mother was a 2 or 3 term mayor of Portola Valley, which is just south of Woodside. He must have stopped through there, ascending the peninsula on his way to the bay.
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
Well, yeah.
Hey, John, David, Pepper, you talk about the Fernandinos and, of course, the San Fernando Valley. I grew up in Northern California, but we always heard about the San Fernando Valley.
Yeah.
And it's I'm still not exactly sure what it encompasses, but I think that's the valley that, if you go east from LA, you go into, right?
Wait,
And as you go up towards Palm Springs, but
yeah, north from LA, I
North.
think.
is it north?
That's where Valley Talk came from. San Fernando.
For sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You can bet on it. Okay. There being no other comments next week, we will start off on the sacred expedition. And I think it's riveting, all the things that go wrong, all the things that have to be overcome. We'll keep a running list as we go. So I've got a couple of chats here. Let me see if I should respond to anything. Thank you, Bob Oxenborough. He did the math. Yes, we all have 32 great grandfathers. And we'll sign off on that scintillating bit of binary information.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
All right. Bye-bye.
It was fun. That was fun.
Thank you. Thank you.
John, can you and Aiko stay on?
Yeah. How are you doing? I'll wait a minute. Let me stop recording.